Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and today's video, I am going to share with you all of the tips and tricks prior to quilting that I wish that I had known before I made my very first quilt. I have a long lead in sometimes. And I think that I'm already inclined to be that way. But quilting, so much of the whole beauty and craft of quilting is how much planing goes into it. So you want to rethread your needle. In this case, I would also put a new needle on your sewing machine. You want to make sure your machine is threaded properly, that you have a full bobbin. If ever there was a time to have a full bobbin, it's now. You want to attach your walking foot. Now, if you have gotten a walking foot and you're like, what the heck? The walking foot really is just feed dogs on the top. Because you have a quilt sandwich, which is backing and then batting and then your quilt top, it's 3 layers plus pins. And if you're relying solely on the feed dogs underneath, it's going to pull that backing very effectively. But the top layer, it's very possible for it to not go through the sewing machine at the same rate as the bottom. So what the walking foot does, it basically takes feed dogs and puts them on the top. So you have top and bottom going like this, pulling the fat. It's like hungry hippos. Do you remember hungry? You know, it's like you push the little button and it goes, yum, yum, yum. The hope there is that it's pulling all 3 layers of fabric through the machine at the same time so that you don't get that sliding. If you use just your regular foot, which you can, especially on a small project like this, but it's more like a surfer sitting on the top of the wave and the waves being pulled underneath and the the little other foot is just along for the ride. We want hungry hippos. You want to make sure in order to do that, there's a little lever on the side. And let me gesture here. It needs to hook onto the post that drives the needle down into the fabric. So that way it's that anchor and it moves like this while the walking foot, feed dogs pull the fabric through. So it's very important that you assemble and attach your walking foot correctly. And you want to make sure it's very nice and tight. I also clean, dust, oil my machine, get all the lint and dust out. It's a good time. You're doing everything else, might as well do that too. And if your machine comes with one of these nifty little things, it's like a table extender. I had one of these on my domestic sewing machine forever and ever and was like, what is the purpose of this? Well, this is the purpose, because when you're quilting, your whole goal is to try to keep the fabric level and moving evenly through the machine. And that will give you the stability and also a place to put the excess of the quilt. I made a practice quilt. And you do not have to do this. I think it's an excellent idea. If you had any extra pieces, it does not have to be this big. I just happen to have enough pieces. And so I literally made a little baby quilt. And you could make a baby quilt that was just 1 block. But it's not a bad idea. In fact, it's an excellent idea because you're going to want to set your tension and you're going to want to make sure you like your thread color choices, and you want to get a handle on where your marker is on your walking foot. Just like when you pieced and you wanted to maintain a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're going to actually do that same thing with the pattern, the quilting pattern that we've chosen. And so you're going to need to know where a 1/4 inch or roughly is on your walking foot. I think most walking feet are similar, and I'm going to point to mine. So right here on the end, and you'll notice when you're handling your walking foot, it sounds like a rattle trap. It's just clickety clackety, and that's okay. There are 2 feet that extend from it. Mine kind of look like skis. The seam is going to go right down the middle, and then from there, the center of the seam to that edge is 1/4 inch on both sides. And that's important because we're going to be sewing and quilting on either side of the seams of our piecing. So we want our seams to be, they don't have to be perfect, but we want them to be uniform. So you can make your little practice quilt just like you made your big quilt sandwich, but it's so much easier. Get yourself a little practice piece. If you don't have enough backing and batting to do a practice quilt, let me show you what you can do. This is our quilt that we're about to start quilting. Do you remember we had the 3 to 4 inches extra batting and backing so that if that quilt top crawled any, we have lots of room to play with. You could pin a little piece of scrap fabric right here to the edge and then just practice a couple of seams because we really do want your tension to be right and we want to like the color before we put a lot of it on a quilt. Obviously, you can do all kinds of thread decisions. So we could do red on the back or, white on the back and red on the front. It all depends on the look that you're going for. And I wanted to show you that in my practice quilt. I made the decision that I'm going to use a tan twill binding. It's just neutral. In my final quilt, it doesn't show stains. And so I thought, I'll do tan on the top and blue on the bottom. So I ran a couple of practice stitches. This first stitch, the tension was off, and you can kind of see that because the blue thread is poking up through the bottom. Same for the second. I just about had it right, although I don't know if it's the thread that I used or if I just really had a hard time with my tension, but I did these several rows and took it out and looked at it, and to me, it just looks kind of dingy. It doesn't look like a thoughtful thread choice. It just looks like it kind of looks dirty. The back I really liked with the blue, which you can see also where I've done the white. The blue, it kind of vanishes, which is nice. But in the end, I decided that I actually did want the contrast of being able to see the quilting. And so then I switched over and put my white thread for my main thread and put a bobbin filled with white thread. And honestly, I just liked it better. And so that's the decision that I made. But I was only able to make that decision because I had done my practice quilt. So I'll stop preaching the practice quilt, but it does really help you figure out some of those choices before you get really all the way invested. Most of the time when we do the quilt sandwich, we do all the pins throughout the whole quilt. But in this case, I like a little pin on the corner just to hold that. It's just the batting and the backing, because sometimes you get to going and you do not realize that your backing has come apart and folded down. And I don't really want to tell you how many times I've done this because you would think I would learn on the first time. And so you'll get all the way down and realize that you have literally sewn a little fold of fabric of your own backing back to the back of the quilting. And then that's not something that you can kind of ignore. You have to deal with it and seam reap it and fold it back and then quilt that section again. So just word to the wise, learn from my mistakes. Just do a little, didn't have to be a big deal, just a little pin in the corner so that it keeps that backing fabric from folding back on itself. Normally with a regular foot, you can sew 3 or 4 inches and kind of see, okay, that looks really good. With a walking foot, you can see whatever I'm sewing right here, I don't see it for another nearly 5 inches. It has to get all the way out from under that walking foot. So even if you don't do a practice quilt, do a practice section in your edge so that you know what it's going to look like. Because once you start quilting, you won't see it until it gets past the walking foot. You do not want to seam over your pins. So you want to, if you get to a place where you're getting, you're boop, 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 boop. Oh gosh, there's a pin in the way. Before it gets all the way under the foot, stop and take your pin out. If you think it's going to miss it, it might not miss it. And if you clip the edge of it, or if the pin moves as it's getting around the foot, it will pull the fabric and it can make your seam go crooked. This is a slow and steady wins the race sort of journey we're on. Actually, I noticed last night my walking foot had a big yellow sticker that says only use 70% power. So basically don't gun it with the walking foot. If it starts having to work really hard, you're pushing too fast, your stitches won't be uniform and even. It tugs on the fabric. It can make you go wonky. And so it's just a Zen-like meditative pace that you're going to take. And I want to show you what that looks like when you don't do that before we get started. So when I was making the sample quilt, I rushed. And as my friend Jennifer says, rushed sewing is seam reaping sewing. And I could probably make a case for taking these seams out. I didn't. Right here, this is like the biggest offender. These stitches, this whole row is just like a wonky. And they're not straight to each other, and they're not a straight line. And actually even that one, I just got in too big of a hurry and didn't maintain a straight line, and it's just really kind of wonky. And if that happens to you, I promise you, there are far worse things in life. And when we get this washed and dried, unless you were looking, you probably wouldn't notice. And this is not going to the county fair for judging. No one's sitting around at home telling me how bad my quilting is. So there's that. But if you're going to do it, let's try to do it right if we can. Here's another example, and I'm going to put it right up here where you can see it, where this pin is. I use that as the visual marker. Do you see that little vroom right here? So it's straight, 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 straight. There was a pin. There was a safety pin. And when I got to it, I knew I wasn't going to run over the pin with my walking foot, but it moved the pin, which pulled the fabric. And so it made that little bump. Now that is not a big bump, but it was unnecessary. I could have just taken the pin out. And then the last thing is this little section right here. I overshot my mark on these two, and I undershot my mark on these two. So these are like big, wide, fat gap, and this is a little tiny, skinny gap, and they don't look uniform. It looks like I had an accident with one of these. So those are some kind of natural pitfalls. Again, don't beat yourself up if that happens. You can take it out or you cannot. When you wash it, it will be way less evident. But if you know that going in to the whole situation, and you know that pacing and taking your time and moving your pins before you get to them, that will help you have a better end result. Okay, so let me move this while I pin my corners with my backing and my batting. I want to tell you the quilting pattern that we're going to do today is called Crosshatch. And what Crosshatch is, we're going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of the rows and columns seams. So everywhere there's a column, we're going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of that seam. And everywhere there's a row, we're going to sew on either side of that seam. And so it makes a hashtag, really, on the back. You won't notice it that way on the front because your eye will have the seam as part of what you're looking at. On the back, it will be very evident that it's a hashtag, which, by the way, another word for hashtag is octothorpe. which I just think is so fun. You will need to keep, just like when we pinned our piecing and we kept our pin bowl next to our sewing machine, but closest to the sewing machine, not the coffee cup, you're going to have the same with your pins. So whatever repository you want to put your pins in, have that nearby. If you decided to get quilting gloves, you will need to get those ready. I have 2 different pairs here. These are actually new. I've not used these a lot. I used them with my practice quilt. But they're grippy on this side and they have a wristband. And then it's kind of nice because for those of us that like the feel of the fabric, there's still that, plus it breathes because it's open. So that's an option. The ones that I have most often used and had first and the longest, and you can tell because the fabric dye has tinted the fingertips. These are called machingers. So it's like fingers and machingers. And this is kind of a little rubbery tip on the end. And they really are pretty badly stained from handling dark and bright fabrics. And then just, life. Either of those are fine. You do not have to use gloves. And then you'll, of course, need your snips to trim threads. Hopefully you won't need your seam ripper, but you might. Reaper. So I don't know about you. I am chomping at the bit to quilt. However, I've got to leave you and let you get yourself together. Maybe do your practice quilt. Maybe get your sewing machine set up. And we're going to come back next week and we're going to jump right on into quilting. And you'll be able to use all of this information that I just gave you to get that quilt quilted. Thanks for being with me. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.